Hello everyone. I hope you all safe with your family members. I'm D. SRUTHI. Now I'm going to explain and summarize the novel The Portrait of a Lady written by Henry James. Let me give the author introduction. Henry James was an American author who became a British citizen in the last year of his life, regarded as a key transitional figure between literary realism and literary modernism, and is considered by many to be among the greatest novelists in the English language. His notable works are The American, The Turn of the Screw, The Portrait of a Lady, Daisy Miller, The Ambassadors, etc. The Portrait of a Lady is a novel by Henry James, first published as a serial in the Atlantic Monthly and the Macmillan's Magazine in 1880–81, and then as a book in 1881. It is one of James' most popular long novels and is regarded by critics as one of his finest. Let me introduce the characters. Isabel Archer. She is the protagonist of the novel who wants to live independent. Isabel is a young woman from Albany, New York, who travels to Europe with her aunt, Mrs. Touchett. Isabel's experience in Europe: she is wooed by an English lord, inherits a fortune, and falls prey to a villainous scheme to marry her to the sinister Gilbert Osmond, force her to confront the conflict between her desire for personal independence and her commitment to social property. Isabel is the main focus of Portrait of the Lady, and most of the thematic exploration of the novel occurs through her actions, thoughts, and experiences. Ultimately, Isabel chooses to remain in her miserable marriage to Osmond rather than to violate a custom by leaving him and searching for a happier life. Next one, Gilbert Osmond. Gilbert Osmond is married to Isabel, a cruel, narcissistic gentleman of no particular social standing or wealth, who seduces Isabel and marries her for her money. An art collector, Osmond poses as a disinterested aesthete, but in reality he is desperate for the recognition and admiration of those around him. He treats everyone who loves him as simply an object to be used to fulfill his desires. He bases his daughter Pansy's upbringing on the ideas that she would be unswervingly subservient to him, and he even treats his longtime lover, Madame Merle, as a mere tool. Isabel's marriage to Osmond forces her to confront the conflict between her desire for independence and the painful social properties that force her to remain in her marriage. Mr. Touchett is the uncle of Isabel, Mrs. Touchett is the aunt of Isabel, and Madame Merle is the friend of Mrs. Touchett. Madame Merle, an unaccomplished, graceful, and manipulative woman. Madame Merle is a popular lady who does not have a husband or a fortune. Motivated by her love for Gilbert Osmond, Merle manipulates Isabel into marrying Osmond, delivering Isabel's fortune into his hand and ruining Isabel's life in the process. Merle is not only Osmond's lover, but she is also Pansy's mother, a fact that was covered up after Pansy's birth. Pansy was raised to believe that her mother died in childbirth. Next one, Ralph Touchett. Ralph Touchett is a cousin of Isabel, Isabel's wise, a funny cousin who is ill with a lung disease throughout the entire novel, which ends shortly after his death. Ralph loves life, but He is kept from participating in this vigorously by his ailments. As a result, he acts as a dedicated spectator, resolving to live vicariously through his beloved cousin Isabel. It is Ralph who convinces Mr. Touchett to leave Isabel her fortune, and it is Ralph who is the stanchest advocate of Isabel remaining independent. Ralph serves as the moral center of Portrait of a Lady. His opinions about other characters are always accurate, and he serves as a kind of moral barometer for the reader, who can tell immediately whether a character is good or evil by Ralph's response to the character. Next one, Lord Warburton, an aristocratic neighbor of the Touchetts who falls in love with Isabel during her first visit to Garncourt. Warburton remains in love with Isabel even after she rejects his proposal and later tries to marry Pansy simply to bring himself closer to Isabel's life. Next one, Caspar Goodwood. He is also a man who proposes Isabel, the son of a prominent Boston mill owner, Isabel's most dedicated suitor in America. Goodwood's charisma, simplicity, capability, and lack of sophistication make him book's purest symbol of James' consumption of America. Next one, Henrietta Stackpole, Isabel's independent friend, a feminist journalist who does not believe that women need men in order to be happy. Like Caspar, Henrietta is a symbol of America's democratic values throughout the book. After Isabel's leave for Europe, Henrietta faced a losing battle to keep her true to her American outlook, constantly encouraging her to marry Caspar Goodwood. At the end of the book, Henrietta disappoints Isabel by giving up her independence in order to marry Mr. Bantling. Next one, Mrs. Touchett. As I've already said, Mrs. Touchett is the aunt of Isabel. Isabel's aunt, Mrs. Touchett, is an indomitable, independent old woman who first brings Isabel to Europe, the wife of Mr. Touchett and the mother of Ralph. Mrs. Touchett is separated from her husband, residing in Florence while he stays at Gardencourt. After Isabel inherits her fortune and falls under the sway of Merle and Oswald, Mrs. Touchett's importance in her life gradually declines. Next one, Pansy Osmond. As I have already said, Pansy is the daughter of Osmond and Madame Merle. Gilbert Osmond's placid, submissive daughter, raised in a convent to guarantee her obedience and docility. Pansy believes that her mother died in childbirth. In reality, her mother is Osmond's a long-time lover, Madame Merle. When Isabel becomes Pansy's stepmother, she learns to love the girl. Pansy is a large part of the reason why Isabel chooses to return to Rome at the end of the novel, when she could escape her miserable marriage by remaining in England. Edward Rosier, a hapless American art collector who lives in Paris. Rosier falls in love with Pansy Osmond and does his best to win Osmond's permission to marry her. But though he sells his art collection and appeals to Madame Merle, Isabel, and the Countess Gemini, Rosier is unable to change Gilbert's mind that Pansy should marry a high-born, wealthy, noble person, not an obscure American with little money and no social standing to speak of. Next one, Mr. Bantling, the game Englishman who acts as Henrietta's escort across Europe, eventually persuading her to marry him at the end of the novel. Next, Countess Gemini, Osmond's vapid sister who covers up her own marital infidelities by gossiping constantly about the affairs of other married women. The Countess seems to have a good heart, however, opposing Merle's scheme to marry Osmond and Isabel and eventually revealing to Isabel the truth of Merle's relationship to Osmond and Pansy's parentage. I hope you all understood the character list. Let me summarize the story of the novel. The novel opens with an American son and father, Ralph and Mr. Touchett, and one Englishman, Lord Warburton, sitting in a garden belonging to a manor called Garden Court in England. They discuss the great hope of the future, and they believe it lies in the women of the time. They declare that a change is coming. Isabel Archer, the main subject of the novel, then appears on the horizon. Her aunt, Mrs. Touchett, has brought her from America so that she can see the world. Isabel Archer is a young, opinionated woman with many ideas of her own, but little concrete experience or practical knowledge. She is unattached, ambitious, and wants to assert her own unique self in life. It is unclear, though, what she can do in life that could help her realize her ambition. Lord Warburton takes an extraordinary step by proposing marriage to Isabel Archer after knowing her for only a short time. He has a great reputation, name, title, and plenty of money. This would make him a good husband in the eyes of society. However, Isabel takes the surprising step of turning him down, even though she likes him very much as a person. This makes her very interesting to her cousin, Ralph Touchett, who wants to see what a woman who turns down Lord Warburton will do with her life. Ralph and Isabel go with Isabel's American friend Henrietta Stackpole to London for a short trip. There, Caspar Goodwood, Isabel's suitor from America, has arrived in order to follow Isabel. He also would like to marry Isabel. He also has a lot of money and has become well established because of his involvement in cotton industry. Isabel tries to refuse him, but he insists. She tells him to leave, at least give her 2 years of freedom from him. The group returns to Garden Court, where Ralph Touchett's father has taken ill and is about to die. There, Isabel meets Madame Merle, a friend of Mrs. Touchett. Madame Merle is a very graceful and talented socialite. Isabel is impressed with her. Meanwhile, Ralph Touchett, who has consumption and expects to die young, tells his father that he does not need all the money of his father would leave him in his will. Instead, Ralph insists that his father give half of his money to Isabel Archer upon his death. Ralph tells his father he would like to see what Isabel will do when she is granted the material wealth that will allow her to enact her ideas. Upon Mr. Touchett's death, Mrs. Touchett, Isabel, Ralph, and Madame Merle go to Florence, Italy, where Mrs. Touchett has her own house. Madame Merle introduces Isabel to her friend Gilbert Osmond, an American collector who resides in Florence. He is distinguished by his impeccable taste in art and other commodities. Gilbert Osmond also has a daughter named Pansy. Madame Merle has a plan to get Isabel to marry Gilbert Osmond. Isabel is surprisingly timid in Osmond's presence and is afraid of saying the wrong thing in his presence. We all know that Pansy is the daughter of Osmond and Madame Merle, but Without knowingly, without knowingly, Isabel accepts to marry Osmond. Isabel travels around Europe for half a year and then goes to Greece and the Asia Minor for another half with Madame Merle. She ends her journey in Rome, where Gilbert Osmond comes to visit her. They become engaged in Rome. Isabel then informs her social acquaintances, beginning with Caspar Goodwood, of her intention to marry Gilbert Osmond. None of them approve. Isabel feels that her act of marrying Gilbert Osmond isolates her from her friends. Several years later, Isabel finds herself in a loveless marriage. She gives all the appearance to others of being happy, hosting Thursday evenings, social gatherings, and representing Gilbert Osmond to the world. But she feels that her husband detests her. He has been unable to change her, to mold her into his image. However, they do not even articulate their dislike for each other. They live civilly but coolly. Isabel realizes that Osmond is a really very shallow and cares too much about what other people think. He likes to show his superiority to the world by pretending to reject its values in favor of his own ideas. But this is just a show because he deeply cares about his image. Here, we clearly know that Osmond married Isabel only for her wealth. When Osmond's daughter Pansy comes of age to be wed, a young man named Edward Rosier pursues her. He asks for assistance from Madame Merle and Isabel. However, Osmond believes that Rosier is neither rich enough for his daughter nor well respected enough. Osmond and Madame Merle would like to Isabel to help marry Pansy to Lord Warburton. So, they want Isabel to approach Lord Warburton for Pansy and Warburton's marriage. They want Isabel to use Lord Warburton's devotion to Isabel to accomplish this, as Lord Warburton already loved Isabel. Isabel ultimately does not want to bring this about, making Osmond believe that she has secretly defeated him. Meanwhile, Ralph has taken a turn for the worse. He visits in Rome for a while, and Osmond is displeased that Isabel spends a lot of time with him. Ralph then returns to his home in Garden Town, where he plans to take his final resting place. Isabel's friends come to Rome to observe whether or not she is really happy in this marriage, of which they all disapproved. Isabel begins to suspect from Madame Merle's overzealous interest in Pansy's marriage that Madame Merle has meddled in her affairs. She then learns from Osmond's sister that Madame Merle is in fact Pansy's mother, and that Osmond and Madame Merle once had an extramarital affair with each other. Isabel is shocked and horrified to realize that Merle has actually manipulated her into marrying Osmond, and that Osmond has married for her husband. So finally, Isabel came to know that Pansy is the daughter of Osmond and Madame Merle, that is, they have an affair already. Isabel's discovery of this fact makes her question whether or not she really was capable of making a free choice all on her own. She realizes that own life is too mixed up in the affairs of others. Yes, her own life is too mixed up in the affairs of others, In order to be free, she must acknowledge the way her life is entangled in social relationships with others. Isabel openly defies her husband when she returns to Garden Court to say goodbye to Ralph on his deathbed. So finally, Ralph is dead. Osmond has meanwhile sent his daughter Pansy to a convent so as to make her forget her love for Edward Rosier. Isabel promises Pansy that she will return. Isabel learns from Madame Merle that Ralph was the one who made her a rich woman. Upon his deathbed, Ralph confessed to having ruined Isabel by giving her so much money and making her a target for fortune hunters. Isabel and Ralph though share an intimate moment and stress the importance of one another for each other's lives. The novel concludes with Caspar Goodwill's arrival at Garden Court and his suggestion to Isabel that they begin a love affair. Since Isabel is so unhappy in her marriage, she refuses and runs away to return to her husband and Pansy in Rome. Even though Goodwill approached for an affair, Isabel refused and returned to her husband and Pansy in Rome. This novel explores the nature of human freedom, moral choice, and conventional social relations. What does it mean to be free? How should the needs of others factor into our lives? It also explores the significance of the aesthetic approach to the objects. Aesthetics is the philosophical exploration of beauty. What makes something beautiful and what makes something a work of art? Henry James is considering how might use the aesthetic approach in our relationships to other people. Is it wrong to see another person as a work of art? What can we learn from reading the story of a person as if it were a portrait of a lady? When James, therefore, creates a certain type of character early in the novel, this character will act in a consistent manner throughout the entire book, this being realistic. The character will never do anything that is not logical and acceptable to his realistic nature or to our conception of what that character should do. In the years later, James, in writing about realism, maintained that he was more interested in a faithful rendition of a character in any given situation than in depicting all aspects of life. Therefore, when he has once drawn Isabel Archer's character in one situation, the reader can anticipate how she will act in any other given situation. Her actions are not accept unexplainable. We are able to logically understand all of her actions. Thus, James' realism would never allow the character to perform actions which would be inconsistent with their true natures. Finally, why Isabel decides to return to Gilbert Osmond must be finally determined by each individual reader. There could be many reasons. Isabel is proud, and in her pride, she cannot stand to admit her mistake to the entire world. As she told Henrietta, she cannot publish her error for the world to see. Furthermore, Isabel puts a great emphasis on her promises. She had undertaken certain marriage vows and she cannot bring herself to break them. Likewise, she had promised Pansy Osmond to return, and finally, in her interview with Caspar Goodwood, Isabel sees the danger she would face it if she does not go back. In the final scene, Isabel is afraid that if she does not return, she would compromise herself and thus would know better than Madame Merle or Countess Gemini. In other words, given Isabel's nature, The only course open to her is to rejoin her husband. Even though she has faced a lot of struggles and obstacles with Osman, she decides to be get united with him finally. Isabel therefore represents the innocent young American who is deceived by the superior cunning and deceit of Osmond and Madame Morley, who are representatives of the old order of European thinking. Isabel was capable of great potential and of great development. She had large capacity for growth and for her life. Her tragedy is in her mistaken judgment of Madame Morley and Gilbert Osmond. Once, however, she has recognized her error, she is determined to try what makes the best of it. It is ironic that Isabel's desire for complete independence causes her to marry Osmond. In her determination to follow only her own evaluation, she refused to listen to her many friends who cautioned her against such a marriage. Consequently, her highest quality also became her downfall. Finally, as per her promise, she united with Pansy and Gilbert Osmond. This is a summarization of the novel Portrait of the Lady written by Henry James. We all know that how many problems she has faced in her entire life. But she overcome, she motivated herself, she overcome all the problems and she involved herself into her life to lead a better life. So, what are all the moral issues within the novel? Greed, freedom, free will, faith, and independence are all moral issues within the novel. I hope you all understood the novel and the summarization of the story and the characters and the critical analysis of the characters and the critical analysis of the story, etc. Thank you.